Hello, and welcome to Living Well, your show for information and inspiration to improve your health and wellness. Welcome to the show, and thanks for watching. We've got a special show for you today. We're going to dedicate the entire show to the topic of personal safety. Whether you live in a city like we do here in Boston or a small town, keeping your personal safety in mind can really make the difference. And so we've got an expert here to talk to us about different aspects of personal safety. Before we begin the show, I'd like to thank the show's major sponsor, Yoga Reaches Out, which is a nonprofit that uses yoga events to raise money for children's charities. And I'd also like to thank my friends at Zumiez Coffee, another sponsor of the show, 221 Main Street in Charlestown. Thank you so much, and visit them for delicious breakfast and lunch. So let's begin the show. Oh, and one more thing. If you're watching the show here in Boston, I know you're watching on BNN, thank you so much. Keep in mind that we post the show on YouTube after every show, and that YouTube channel is Bare Bones Yoga. So check us out. You can also see past episodes there as well. So let's begin. Hi.
Hi.
I'd like to introduce you to Gershon Ben Karen. Gershon is a security professional with 20 years working in the security industry as an operator, trainer, and consultant. He has trained military units, including members of special forces, security agencies, and civilians in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the US, in self-protection, personal safety, and hand-to-hand combat. He has a third-degree black belt in Krav Maga, the unarmed combat system of the Israeli Defense Forces, and was trained and certified in Israel. He is the author of the critically acclaimed Krav Maga Real-World Solutions for Real-World Violence, and runs Krav Maga Yashir in Boston, in Charlestown, for the largest dedicated Krav Maga training facility in the U.S. on the East Coast. Welcome to the show, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I wanted to start out by sharing a little bit about my initial motivation for inviting you on the show. And, you know, we talked about this in the first time I met you, and it really was driven by this idea of how to protect yourself in an active shooter situation. And once we talked a little bit, my thoughts shifted to really more of a discussion around personal safety being helpful. Can you share a little bit about that?
I think it's very natural when you have events in the news that you sort of emotionally gravitate towards them. And active shooter situations are ones which basically have a high number of casualties and in their very nature are random in appearance. It's important to understand how we react to numbers when we look at events involved with violence. So if the number's too great, it doesn't feel personal enough. And if the number's too small, basically it doesn't seem relevant. So active shooter situations where we're talking about maybe 20 deaths and maybe 80 injured, it's a small enough number for us to actually start to really feel that that's a tragedy that could happen to us. The other thing as well with active shooter is there's a big difference between violence which targets groups and violence that targets individuals. So violence that targets an individual is largely predictable. So if we take a mugging incident, there are signs and pre-indicators in that situation that alert us to the possible danger, as long as we're trained and we can understand them. With violence that targets groups such as active shooter, terror attacks, we don't have that predictive element. So anybody who went to work in the Twin Towers on 9/11 couldn't have predicted that 2 planes were going to fly into those towers. Anybody who was in Bataclan in Paris couldn't have predicted that there were going to be active shooters in that situation. So we feel very much that we're out of control in those situations. And so we naturally want to seek knowledge to find out how we could control them. The problem is when we focus on specific incidents, we lose that general safety awareness, which is actually the foundation.
We kind of put it to the back burner.
Yeah, because we want to know exactly how to deal with active shooter.
Just that one thing.
And the problem with it is most of the ways of dealing with an active shooter come from general situational awareness. So when I look at situational awareness, 3 other things that I'm considering in the environment are exit and entry routes and points of concealment. So if I have good situational awareness, I know where people are going to be entering from, I know where I can exit, I know where they might be able to conceal themselves, and I know where I might be able to conceal myself. So if we look at training for active shooter, a lot of it comes back to those general skills. And when we train people for active shooter situations, whether it's educational facilities or companies, we really start off at that level. So rather than looking at active shooter, let's understand our environment. The other thing as well, when we look at statistically, over the past 13 years, active shooter situations have averaged 11.4 incidents a year in the entire US. If we look at a city like Boston, in the same time period, it's averaged 30,000 muggings stroke street robberies. So when we look at what are we likely to face, we're much more likely to be in a mugging situation where our general personal safety skills will get us out of trouble than we are going to be in an active shooter situation. In the security industry, we talk about things which are low risk, high consequence, and high risk, low consequence. So an active shooter situation, it's a low risk with a high consequence, but something like a mugging is a high risk with a low consequence.
Risk of happening.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, of occurring to a person.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So even though the active shooter gets the most visibility, generally the risk is fairly low to the person.
And the thing is, this also tells us about where we should be gaining our information around personal safety. And it's not really from news agencies, because news agencies are going to report on what's newsworthy. And that tends to be the things that happen out of the ordinary. You never hear on the news of an incident where two guys in a bar got into an argument, there was a bit of pushing, and then one walked off. That's what happens in more day-to-day violence, but it's not newsworthy. So again, we have to be really careful when we're trying to work out what we're at risk from using the news agencies as a source.
Okay, great. So when the topic of personal safety comes up in conversation, and this kind of ties into what you're saying, people tend to want to learn physical techniques to protect themselves. I was at a dinner the other day, and the mom that I was with was saying to her daughter, I want you to go get trained on personal safety. Why are we so quick to want to learn how to physically do something?
I think it comes from that worst case scenario. And also, we tend to be presented with the idea of violence, that it's entirely random, there are no warning signals. So all we've got left is that physical self-defense. There was an incident that happened in South Boston last year, which kind of illustrates where personal safety and physical self-defense fit in. There were two women, they were walking in South Boston late at night, and they had an attempted robbery. It was basically foiled by an off-duty policeman, and the two assailants ran away. The women wrote a letter to Fox News, to basically a civic duty to alert people that these guys were operating in the area. And in the letter, they said, although we'd both taken self-defense courses, and although they were useful, everything happened too fast and too quickly for us. And this is one of the problems with physical self-defense. When you're attacked physically, all the odds are against you. The attacker, the assailant, has chosen to deny you the time and space to react. So it's almost too late. If, however, you have some good personal safety skills around your awareness, that you can identify that threat before it actually gets to you, now you have time to prepare and get yourself ready to employ physical techniques. Or possibly exit the situation and not have to do them at all. So really, if we look at physical self-defense, it's pretty much useless without a personal safety piece. You'd have to have many years of training for that not to be the case. I've been training since I was 8 years old. That's 30 plus years. If I was attacked unawares, surprised, the odds are really stacked against me, even though I'm trained and the person attacking me isn't trained. What I rely on, and I've relied on in my career, is being able to identify things before they occur, prepare myself, put myself in a ready state, both mentally and physically, so that I can then deal with the attack. There was something interesting as well that they also said in a letter regarding personal safety. They said, even though we were walking together, that wasn't a deterrent.
Which they almost always say in the news, make sure women don't walk alone.
Absolutely, and it's still good advice. However, if we look at what the particular threats are, if you're trying to prevent yourself from being sexually assaulted, it's great to be with another person, because a sexual assailant is looking for a lone victim. However, muggers are going to look for as many purses, bags that they can steal. So two people is a more active proposition than one. And this is something where we sometimes think we're relying on good common sense. And I'm sure those two women, without judging them, we're working off that basis that we don't really need to be aware of danger.
Because someone's with me.
Yeah, because I'm not alone.
She's my protection.
And this is when we have that kind of half an idea. We understand, okay, that will protect us against this person, but we don't understand, will it protect us against somebody else?
I haven't thought of that more bags, more persons aspect.
So one of the things when we look at violence is we have to look at the motivation. So we look at basic 5 situational components: location, your relationship with the attacker. Often in the case of female self-defense, your assailant is going to be somebody that you know. Their motive, in this case, it's financial rather than personal. They're not looking for you. They're looking for things of you. And in that case, the more of you are,
better for them.
Absolutely. And then we look at your state of mind. What level of preparedness are you in? And that goes to, have you thought about these events before they occur? And also, how are you thinking in the situation? And then we look at third parties who are with you. So in that case, these 2 individuals are basically, they were with each other. And your responses to violence might change based on the third parties. So if you have a small child with you, you might need a different solution to that situation than if you're on your own.
Right.
And so what we try and teach is people to make these dynamic risk assessments of situations rather than just give them a blind set of rules, which is make sure you're always walking with somebody else. And this is one of the problems with a rules-based approach to personal safety, that rule works in one context, but it doesn't work in another. The other problem with rules is they often tend to be, don't do this. So they tell us what not to do, but not what to do. So a classic one that always gets mentioned is not running with headphones in.
Right.
And people by default think that if they take the headphones out, they're going to be safer. And the problem is that's not the case. It's just saying don't run with headphones in.
It's just the one aspect.
It's not saying, but these are the things you should be doing. Because if you don't know what you're looking for, it doesn't really matter whether you've got the headphones in or not. You still don't know what you're looking for. So we try and stay away from those rules. And we try and turn around and say, let's teach people to make these risk assessments of the situations they're in, and then create solutions based on the factors in them.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, I think at this point, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to talk about a couple other aspects of this. All right. We'll be right back.
Because I want to be a good example for my son.
Because I want my children to have healthy and loving relationships.
Because we can show boys
they have the power to prevent harm or abuse.
Because you taught me that racist and sexist jokes are not okay.
Because I want to teach my players respect.
Because every boy needs to know that somebody cares about them.
Because strong men don't hide their fears or emotions.
Because I'm not afraid to admit that I was wrong.
or don't have the answer.
Because no one should fear the person that is supposed to love them.
Because supporting fairness, equality, and empathy is what men do.
Men are an important piece of the puzzle to ending violence against women. Let's reimagine manhood.
Hi, we're back. So let's go into a little bit about, in today's environment, this shared economy, we're doing things like staying in people's homes. Sometimes they're even there. We don't know these people. We're getting in cars of people that we don't know. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe our mindset should be different around these things?
The first thing is sometimes our definitions of stranger are too tight or too loose. So it's worth coming up with a couple of definitions. We have absolute strangers, which are people we've never met. They're actually very few and far between when we look at our daily interactions, because we also have another category of stranger which is called a consequential stranger. So these are people who we use for services, people we might interact with on a daily basis, but we don't really have an intimate tie.
Right.
So not all strangers are kind of the same.
Right.
So we have ride-sharing people, drivers, taxi drivers, who would be classed as consequential strangers, people who provide a service for us. For instance, when Lyft and Uber came to Boston, we were very aware of would this be a potential danger? Would this be a service that the wrong type of people could exploit? And equally, looking at those, we had to look at the taxi services as well and go, okay, which one, as it were, is the safer? We tend to think that officially regulated organizations tend to be safer than self-regulated organizations. In the case of the ride-sharing schemes and taxis, that hasn't proven really to be the case. So for example, quick statistic, in 2015, 10% of Boston taxi drivers who applied to become Uber drivers actually failed the background check. So you have the situation where a self-regulated background check is actually better than the one that's being conducted by Boston city officials. That's not true of every city. There are certain cities which have more stringent regulations. There's also been a number of corruption cases with taxi owners, the company owners, bribing officials to actually pass people through background checks who shouldn't have done this. There was a famous case in 2006 with Piotr Waserman and his associate, who had paid $30,000 in bribes to a city clerk official to get 20 people licensed who wouldn't have otherwise been licensed. So you have something where, can I really trust that process? That's not to say that the ride-sharing schemes are perfect. And again, sometimes when we look at the processes of how does a ride-sharing scheme employ somebody and how does a taxi firm employ people, Uber, for example, doesn't do a face-to-face interview. Lyft does. Taxi firms do face-to-face interviews. And then we have to go, well, is an interview process and actually a good way of determining whether somebody is safe or not safe? And really, when we look at, we do a lot of consultancy on workplace violence, we find that many companies don't consider personal safety when they employ somebody. Because really what they're looking for is somebody's competency to do the job. That's the number one thing. So if somebody appears to be like an immaculate driving record, you know, whether it's Lyft or the taxi companies, it's that case of like, oh, he's got an immaculate driving record.
They'll get through, hired.
Yeah, and we'll rely on the background checks.
To catch the high risk.
We also can look at other risks, not just from personal safety, from others. When we look at personal safety, we're also looking at incidents such as what's the risk of being involved in a road traffic accident. That's something that people don't necessarily think of in terms of personal safety. Everybody gets caught up in the, well, you're teaching me to identify predatory individuals. That's not all of it. We are also looking at the other threats and dangers that you might face. One of the interesting things in Boston is that insurance for bodily injury, taxi companies are required to have 85% less coverage than a Lyft driver or an Uber driver.
Interesting.
So if you're actually involved in a road traffic accident in a taxi, you're probably going to be fighting for your compensation. So there's a lot of things when we start looking at it where the taxis have certain advantages, the ride-sharing services have other advantages. Unfortunately, we have no statistics about which is safer because when the police report on incidents, they don't report whether it's an Uber driver, they don't report on it's a taxi.
So we're at a bit of a disadvantage.
Yeah, so we have to basically look at the situation and go, what do we know about the drivers? And past experience is really a good indicator of prospective behaviors. So with the taxi driver who turns up, we know they've gone through a background check, we know that they've gone through an interview. We kind of know that that's the same for the Lyft driver and the Uber. We know that potentially there might have been a corruption situation. We know that's probably unlikely in the way that the ride-sharing companies do it. But one of the good things that the ride-sharing companies do is they actually have that star rating.
Right.
So we don't have that with a taxi driver. So we actually have some history.
Other people's impressions.
Have commented on them. The other thing, when you look at the apps that they use, a taxi driver, his journey is not being tracked. So it's being a dispatcher. So if a taxi driver decides to make a detour, pull off to the side of the road, that's not going to be logged. With the apps that the Uber and Lyft drivers use, that journey is tracked from start to finish. If they deviate at all, that's recorded.
Wow.
So in terms of opportunity to commit a crime, it's probably less with the Lyft and the Uber drivers than the taxi.
See, and I always thought because you called a dispatcher to pick you up, that somehow meant that person, but there's no electronic tracking like in the case of the Uber.
And the truth of it is, if we look at the way that Uber and Lyft have worked in Europe, they've actually started to incorporate taxi firms. So the way it's probably going is everything is going to be Uber and Lyft, whether we kind of like it or not.
Sure.
And hopefully at that point, they'll also up, you know, what they're doing.
Okay.
The other thing, just from a purely physical one, which I like, as somebody working in the security industry, I don't like being in the back seat of a car. In a taxi, I'm often forced to be in that back seat. Lyft drivers actually are told, bring, if it's a single passenger, into the front seat.
Interesting.
Because it's safe for the driver and it's safer for you. Because if I think of a situation where, let's say I'm a female, and I get in a car, and the guy drives and puts the central locking on, and I'm in the back seat, I'm trapped in that area now. If I'm sitting in the passenger seat, I have access to release that central locking and get out. So I often look on the taxis as you're in this encased tomb, as it were. And if I had the option, I would like to be sitting in the front. And the Lyft and Uber guys give me that option.
Give you that option. Okay, great. All right, this is a lot of amazing info. I'm actually learning a lot along the way as well. So we're going to take a quick break and then come back with a couple more points to go over. Stay tuned.
Don't wait. Communicate. Make your emergency plan today.
Hi, and welcome back. So before we kind of wrap up here, let's just get to this one point about when you have an uneasy feeling when you're around somebody. Do you trust that instinct?
Absolutely. Your fear system has evolved over thousands and thousands of years. It is really adept at picking up danger in an environment. If we take somebody walking behind us, we've all had that sensation, somebody's behind us. Basically what happens is our subconscious fear system picks up on the footsteps, gives us a shot of adrenaline, we feel that nervousness, and we go, there's somebody behind us. They may just be walking behind us to tell us we've dropped something, but their movement is such that it's akin to the movement of somebody who means us harm. So we need to trust that instinct, and that's when we perform the dynamic risk assessment and work out, is that a dangerous person or somebody who we don't have to really consider as a threat.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sure that all of what you've discussed is part of the training that you do when you work with people in person. So tell us just a little bit about, especially the training for women on Saturdays.
So our studio is in Charlestown, right under the Tobin Bridge. It might seem a bit of a dodgy location, but actually if I was to go into it, it's probably one of the safest places you could be. We run a free women's self-defense class, 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning till 11 a.m. We do 40 minutes of physical self-defense, and we have a modular program where we talk about different topics such as sexual assault, stalking, identifying potentially abusive partners. We also teach pepper spray. We have a website, womenselfdefenseboston.com, which has all the details on there. And our mission is really to get as many people as we can trained up in personal safety and self-defense.
That's great. Well, thank you, Gershon, so much for being on the show. This, I mean, we could have dedicated even more time to it, but thank you so much. This has been great. Well, thank you so much for watching. Please remember, you can catch the show at 7 a.m. on Fridays on BNN and also YouTube, Bare Bones Yoga. And as you watch it, please tweet any comments and feedback to #LivingWellBNN. Thanks so much for watching. Until our next show, live well.